The city of Rome held its breath. Inside the grand hall of the Palazzo dei Congressi, the air was heavy with anticipation. World leaders, diplomats, and journalists filled every seat. The walls, soaked in history, seemed to lean in to listen. On stage stood Giorgia Meloni. She wasn't just another politician giving a speech. There was something in her posture calm, grounded, but her eyes told a deeper story. They burned with purpose. With her notes in hand, she stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone, and looked out into the sea of eyes staring back at her. Her opening was predictable. She talked about the global economy, trade balances, inflation, the usual. But then, her tone shifted. "We can't talk about fairness," she said, pausing, "without talking about history." The room stirred. She spoke of colonialism not just in general terms, but with specifics. Her words cut through the air like a razor. France's ongoing economic influence in Africa. The CFA franc. She didn't say it with bitterness, but with clarity. "This currency is not just money," she said. "It's a chain." Some in the crowd straightened in their seats. Others looked to their colleagues uneasy. Cameras zoomed in. Every word was being broadcast live around the world. Her aides shifted nervously backstage. They hadn't expected her to go this far. But she kept going. Giorgia spoke not with anger, but with something even more powerful: conviction. She wasn't attacking. She was unveiling. And in that moment, it wasn't about applause or headlines. It was about truth. Far away, in a dusty office in Burkina Faso, someone was listening. But right now, in Rome, something had changed. You could feel it. It was like a match had been struck in a dark room. You didn't know what would catch fire, but you knew something would. As Giorgia Meloni left the podium, the silence was louder than any applause. Not because people didn't care, but because they were stunned. Something real had just happened. And no one, absolutely no one, could ignore it. Thousands of miles away from Rome, in the heart of Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his office. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only the soft hum of desert wind and flickering lights of Ouagadougou outside his window. His desk was cluttered papers, reports, worn folders filled with economic forecasts and diplomatic briefings. But his eyes were fixed on one thing: his phone. He was re-watching Giorgia Meloni's speech. Not just once, 3 times already. And yet, each time, it hit him differently. There was something in the way she spoke, not just the content, but the feeling, the way she dared to say out loud what so many had whispered for decades. The chains, the injustice, the history. As she uttered the words, "This is not just money. It's a chain." Something inside him stirred. A tightness in his chest. A memory. A wound. And something else. Hope. When the video ended, he didn't move. For a long moment, he just stared at the blank screen. Then, he slowly lowered the phone and looked out across the capital. The flag of Burkina Faso waved gently under the warm wind. He whispered to himself, almost too soft to hear, "Finally, someone understands." He wasn't thinking like a president in that moment. He was thinking like a man who had grown up watching his people struggle, watching promises break, watching silence become the norm. And now, someone across the ocean had said the words his country could never get the world to hear. Down the hall, his aides were waiting. There were meetings, memos, decisions. But for just a minute more, he let the silence wrap around him. He stood up, walked to the window, and placed a hand gently on the glass. Outside, children laughed in the streets. Life was still moving, but something had changed. Not out there yet. Inside him. And in that quiet desert capital, a spark had been lit. He didn't know what he would do next, but he knew this much. This couldn't be ignored. Laura Bianchi wasn't the kind of journalist who chased press releases. While others typed up what they were told, she dug for what was hidden. A senior correspondent in Rome, she had seen her share of political theater. Speeches came and went, promises made, forgotten. But something about Giorgia Meloni's address didn't sit like the others. As the room emptied and headlines began forming, Laura stayed behind. She replayed Meloni's speech on her laptop, not once, not twice, but 4 times. With each viewing, her eyes narrowed. There was a tremor beneath the words. A weight. This wasn't just a soundbite for social media. It felt like the start of something. This isn't diplomacy, she whispered. This is a rupture. Back at her office, she pushed aside every assignment on her plate. She opened a blank document and began typing furiously. Not just notes, but a story. A real one. She didn't know where it was going yet, but she could feel it. Her editor, Matteo, peeked in. You look like you've seen a ghost. I think I've seen a spark, she replied, fingers flying across the keyboard. And it might just burn through the whole system. As night fell, she cross-referenced past interviews, economic data, and archived speeches. She pulled up reports on the CFA franc, an obscure currency to most Europeans, but a daily reality for millions in Africa. The more she read, the more she realized this system wasn't just outdated. It was deeply embedded in a legacy many refused to acknowledge. How had this gone unquestioned for so long? By midnight, Laura had written over 3,000 words. Raw, urgent, unfinished, but powerful. She paused, only to sip coffee, gone cold. She didn't have the full picture yet, but she had a thread, and she was going to pull it. This wasn't about political sides. It was about truth, about untold stories. And for the first time in a long while, Laura felt like she wasn't just reporting history, she was standing at the edge of it. She saved her draft, leaned back, and stared out the window. Somewhere, something had begun to shift. And she wasn't going to let the world miss it. By morning, the world had split in two. In Paris, headlines screamed, Meloni oversteps. Italy sparks diplomatic rift. Behind closed doors, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs called an emergency session. The minister, stiff in a grey suit, tapped his fingers on the polished table. This is unnecessary interference, he said. She's trying to win points at the expense of our legacy. A younger aide muttered, or maybe she's just telling the truth. The room fell quiet for a beat. Back in Rome, praise and panic flowed in equal measure. Some European leaders applauded Meloni's courage. Others called her reckless. Analysts filled morning shows with clashing opinions, some framing her as a bold reformer, others as a populist gambling with history. But halfway across the world, in Africa, the reaction was very different. On the streets of Ouagadougou, in Burkina Faso, people gathered with signs that read, "We are heard," and Africa is not silent anymore. Videos flooded social media, young people chanting Meloni's name, not because they saw her as a savior, but because, for once, someone in power had named the truth. Hashtags like #AfricaListens and #MeloniTruth trended from Accra to Nairobi. President Ibrahim Traoré, watching it all unfold from the palace, knew this wasn't just symbolic. It was kinetic. Something had moved. His chief advisor, Moussa Dio, stormed into the office with a tablet in hand. Mr. President, it's spreading. This is bigger than anything we've seen. The media, the protests, the unity. This is momentum. Traoré nodded slowly. Yes, but momentum can be dangerous if we don't steer it. His cabinet was divided. Some saw a chance to make a bold diplomatic statement, maybe even realign economically. Others warned that any response could be seen as a political alliance, something the country couldn't afford. He stood quietly at the window, watching the flag ripple against a hot afternoon wind. There's something different about this moment, he finally said. But we have to be careful. Movements can lift you up or crush you beneath their weight. The world was watching. And for the first time in years, Africa wasn't in the footnotes, it was at the center of the page. President Ibrahim Traoré stood beneath the old trees of the palace garden, walking slowly with his advisor, Musa. The scent of earth and jasmine clung to the warm air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The echoes of the protests, the social media storm, the foreign headlines, all of it, still lingered like a hum just outside the walls. Musa finally broke the silence. "Sir, we have to make a decision. The world is listening. Do we respond?" Traoré stopped and looked toward the setting sun. "She didn't ask for anything," he said quietly. "Meloni?" He nodded. She stood there and said it, knowing the risks. No conditions. No hand extended. Just truth. Musa folded his arms, which makes it even more powerful. That truth had reached millions, but to Traoré, it felt personal, as if someone halfway across the world had looked into the soul of his people and didn't flinch. In Rome, Giorgia Meloni sat at a small table with her chief of staff, reviewing diplomatic cables. "You've stirred something deep," her aide warned. "Some governments are furious." She closed the folder. "Good. Maybe they should be." Her gaze drifted toward the open window, the Italian evening spilling in. "I didn't say anything new," she said. "But maybe I said it loud enough this time." Neither she nor Traoré had spoken directly. No phone call, no letter, no handshake. And yet, a bridge had formed between themen of principle, not politics. A bridge built from words. In Ouagadougou, Traoré returned to his office. The room felt quieter than usual. On his desk, someone had printed out Meloni's full speech, highlighted passages, underlined phrases. He ran his fingers across the paper, feeling its weight. He had once believed that no one in the West truly listened, that their speeches were just theater. But this one, it carried something else. Intent and sincerity. That night, as both leaders sat worlds apart, neither of them realized the depth of what had just begun. No treaties had been signed, no promises exchanged. Yet history doesn't always start with declarations. Sometimes it begins with a single voice saying what others are too afraid to. And sometimes that's enough to shake the world awake. Laura Bianchi had a gut feeling, and she always followed her gut. A week after Meloni's speech, she packed a small suitcase, kissed her cat goodbye, and caught the next train to Paris. She wasn't chasing quotes. She was chasing roots-buried ones. The French capital greeted her with its usual charm and cold stares. But Laura wasn't here for croissants and café chatter. She had interviews scheduled, access to archives, and a burning question in her chest. How could something as controversial as the CFA franc still exist? She met with economists in quiet offices, historians in cramped apartments, and former African diplomats who had long retired from the spotlight. What they shared wasn't just détente, was disillusionment. "The CFA isn't just a currency," one professor said, thumbing through yellow documents. "It's a leash." That word echoed in Laura's mind. Leash. In a quiet cafe in the 7th arrondissement, Laura flipped through case studies detailing how countries using the CFA franc had to deposit half of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. 50%. Still, in the 21st century. She dropped her pen. "How is this real?" she whispered. Her investigation deepened. She uncovered memoirs decades old, outlining financial structures designed to benefit France at the expense of its former colonies. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, legacy, power cloaked in bureaucracy. That night, Laura sat in her tiny Paris hotel room, staring at the blinking cursor on her laptop. The evidence was clear. What Meloni had hinted at wasn't just symbolic, it was systemic. And no one in Europe seemed to be talking about it. Until now. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. This wasn't just a political story. It was human. It was generational. And it had been hiding in plain sight. By the time she closed her laptop, her article draft had grown to 5,000 words, and her conviction even more. Laura knew she was touching a nerve. But that's exactly what she came for. She didn't want to just write headlines. She wanted to write history. President Ibrahim Traoré stood before a wall-sized map of West Africa, red markers dotting trade routes, pipelines, and old colonial boundaries. Around him, his inner circle buzzed with energy and unease. "This could be our window," Moussa Dio said, tapping a marker with his pen. "We're not alone. Mali, Niger, even Senegal, they're all watching. Some are ready." It wasn't just excitement. It was pressure. Meloni's speech had cracked something open. Laura's reporting had added fuel. And now, African leaders quietly at first, then more boldly had begun reaching out. Messages of solidarity, suggestions for economic realignment, even whispers of a coalition. Traoré sat down slowly. He understood the moment. It was rare, it was fragile, and it could be dangerous. One misstep, and Burkina Faso could lose international funding, face sanctions, or worse, become isolated. But doing nothing? That felt even more dangerous now. "What if this is our only chance to move?" he asked the room. Silence. Then one minister spoke, her voice low. "If we act, they'll respond. Retaliate. Economically, diplomatically. And if we don't?" Traoré said. No one answered. Across the capital, the streets were alive. Community groups were organizing forums, students were sharing translated excerpts of Meloni's speech, and even farmers in rural provinces were tuning in on crackling radios. People weren't just inspired. They were expecting something. The president stood again. He walked to the window, staring out at the national flag fluttering above the palace gate. "She risked everything for her truth," he said quietly. "Are we going to do less for ours?" Moussa approached. "Then we prepare, carefully. No grand declarations, no sudden breaks. But we start the process." Traoré nodded. "Start discreet discussions with neighboring states. Propose an economic review panel. Quiet, but serious." "And if word leaks?" Moussa asked. "Let it." Traoré looked back at the Mapat. All the lines drawn by history, by power, by silence. "It's time we redraw some of these ourselves." That night, in a secure room beneath the palace, the first draft of a coalition proposal was written. No slogans, no speeches, just plans. And for the first time in a generation, the conversation in West Africa wasn't about aid or dependence. It was about dignity. The article dropped at sunrise. Its title was simple, but heavy. A Bridge Between Two Worlds. Laura Bianchi had poured her entire soul into it. 3 weeks of interviews, travel, research, sleepless nights, and one moment of clarity when she watched Traoré's eyes light up during their interview. In her piece, she didn't just quote. She translated emotion. She described Meloni's speech not as a political bombshell, but as an echo of truths long buried. She wrote of Traoré's stillness, the way his hands trembled when he said, "It felt like someone finally saw us." She tied it all together: centuries of history, decades of economic imbalance, and the fragile miracle of two leaders who had never met, yet understood one another through courage alone. By noon, the story had gone viral. Journalists around the world reposted it. Analysts debated it live on air. Activists in Nairobi, Accra, and Dakar read passages aloud at protests. The phrase, "a bridge between two worlds," trended across multiple languages. But it wasn't just viral. It was personal. One reader in South Africa commented, "I sent this to my grandmother," she cried. She lived through the CFA years. A teenager in the US wrote, "This story made me Google Burkina Faso for the first time in my life." Even in Rome, Meloni sat in her office, eyes scanning the article. When she reached the part about Traoré's emotional response, she paused. "He actually said that?" she asked arrayed, eyes glassy. "Yes, word for word." She looked out the window. Then it was worth it. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré stood before a camera in a quiet room. No flags, No press. Just him, a mic, and a message. To Madam Meloni, he began. You spoke truth, not for benefit, but for dignity. And for that we thank you. He paused. We do not seek conflict. We seek partnership. But partnership begins with honesty. The video lasted 2 minutes. But when it aired, it shook the world all over again. Back in her hotel, Laura sat at her desk, reading thousands of comments from readers across continents. Some skeptical, many emotional, most grateful. She closed her laptop, took a breath, and whispered to herself, this was the story I was born to tell. What started as a ripple had become a tide. Across Africa, things were changing. Leaders who once hesitated now spoke boldly. From Ghana to Chad, quiet murmurings turned into open conversations about economic independence, transparency, and reform. For the first time in decades, the continent wasn't reacting to outside pressure, it was setting its own tone. Traoré led with a calm intensity. He didn't hold rallies or give fiery speeches. Instead, he traveled to rural provinces, meeting with farmers and merchants, listening to their needs, and outlining a simple vision: self-reliance. In one village, he stood beneath a mango tree, addressing a crowd of barefoot children and elders alike. We must learn to feed ourselves before we beg for grain, he said, and we must value our currency before anyone else will. His words weren't grandioso, but they struck deep. They weren't meant for cameras, yet they went viral anyway. Back in Europe, the political landscape was shifting too. In Paris, the French president took to the podium. His tone was measured, almost apologetic. We are open to reviewing the structure of the CFA system, he said. The world is evolving, and so must we. Many saw it as a delayed reaction, a reluctant pivot to save face, but others saw something else. A recognition that the story had slipped from the hands of the powerful and into the hands of the people. Laura's article had now been translated into 19 languages. University professors used it in classrooms. Activist groups held workshops around it. A film proposal landed on her desk. But she stayed grounded. The real story, she knew, was still unfolding. In Rome, Meloni's popularity surged. Some hailed her as a visionary. Others labeled her dangerous. But she didn't flinch. In an interview, she said simply, I just told the truth. The world decided what to do with it. And that world was no longer the same. Because of one speech, one article, one response, and an invisible bridge that continued to grow stronger by the day. The headlines now read differently. Not about unrest, but about awakening. Months had passed, but the story refused to fade. In Ouagadougou, the sound of construction echoed through once-forgotten rural towns. Schools were being built. Farmers had access to local credit. In a new currency pilot designed by regional economists, food markets were vibrant again, not because of foreign aid, but because of local production. President Traoré moved quietly, with resolve. He no longer needed headlines. His focus was on results. During a press conference, when asked if he was challenging global powers, he simply replied, "We are not fighting the world. We are learning to stand." His message was clear. No more dependency. No more silence. In Rome, Giorgia Meloni's advisors begged her to pivot. Play safer. Speak softer. She didn't. At a global conference on historical justice, she took the stage and declared, "Leadership isn't about comfort. It's about courage. And courage means listening, even when it's inconvenient." The room fell silent. Then came applause. In a quiet corner of the conference, Laura Bianchi took notes for her next piece. She wasn't a star, despite the accolades and the book deal. She was still, at heart, a listener, a bridge builder. Her book, Invisible Bridges, had become a global bestseller used in classrooms, read at dinner tables, discussed on news panels. But for Laura, its greatest achievement was this. It gave people a shared language to talk about justice, without shouting. Meanwhile, in Paris, reforms began not sweeping, but real. Laws were proposed. Trade agreements were reviewed. The old guard protested, but the momentum was too strong. The world had changed its tone. One morning, Traoré stood at a balcony in the palace, watching children play in the dusty courtyard below. "Our fight is for dignity," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. At that same hour, Meloni flipped through a book on African history, highlighting passages as the light spilled over her desk. She paused, smiled, and said, "Sometimes all we need is to listen." No treaties had been signed between them, no photo ops, and yet their connection had moved more than policy. It had moved hearts, and in a divided world, that mattered more than anyone expected. As Laura later wrote, "The world doesn't need more walls, it needs bridges. And sometimes those bridges begin with a whisper, not a roar."